In March of 1859, over 400 men, women, and children stood shivering in the rain outside a racetrack in Savannah, Georgia. They weren't there to watch horses. They were the horses. For 2 entire days, these human beings would be inspected, prodded, and sold to the highest bidder in what became the largest single slave auction in American history. The sale was so devastating, so filled with screams and separated families, that it earned a name whispered in horror for generations, the weeping time. But what led to this unimaginable atrocity? And why did one of America's wealthiest men decide to destroy 400 lives in a single transaction? Before we uncover the truth behind America's darkest auction, subscribe, hit that bell, and comment below which state you're watching from. The story begins not in Savannah, but on the coastal islands of Georgia, where a man named Pierce Butler built an empire on human suffering. Butler wasn't born into cruelty. He was born into wealth so staggering that he never had to lift a finger in his entire life. His grandfather, also named Pierce Butler, was one of the framers of the United States Constitution, a man who helped write the words "all men are created equal" while owning over 500 human beings. The younger Butler inherited 2 massive rice and cotton plantations, Butler Island and Hampton Point. These weren't farms, they were factories of misery, where enslaved people worked knee-deep in snake-infested swamps, cultivating rice under conditions so brutal that malaria and dysentery were considered normal. The death rate was so high that Butler constantly had to purchase new people to replace those who'd been worked to death. But Pierce Butler didn't see death. He saw numbers in a ledger. By the 1850s, Butler was living in Philadelphia, spending money like water while his plantations generated the cash flow. He married a famous British actress named Fanny Kemble, a woman who would later become one of abolition's most powerful voices. When Fanny first visited Butler's plantations in 1838, she was horrified. She kept a detailed journal of what she witnessed: pregnant women forced to work until labor, children as young as 6 working the fields, people whipped until their backs were shredded meat. She described the smell of the slave quarters, the moans of the sick left to die without medicine, the hopelessness in every face. Fanny begged her husband to treat these people with basic humanity. Pierce's response was to forbid her from interfering and to remind her that she had no legal authority over his property. The marriage collapsed. Fanny left him and took their daughters, but because of the laws of the time, Pierce retained custody and control. The journal she kept, it wouldn't be published until 1863, during the Civil War, when it became a weapon against the Confederacy. But in 1859, Fanny's words were still locked away, and Pierce Butler was about to make a decision that would eclipse even her darkest descriptions. Butler had a problem. He was broke. Not poor, but broke in the way only the obscenely wealthy can be. He'd gambled away a fortune, made terrible investments, and lived far beyond even his massive means. His plantations were still profitable, but the money wasn't coming fast enough to cover his debts. He owed over $300,000, a sum that would be worth tens of millions today. His creditors were circling, and Southern honor demanded he pay. But Pierce Butler had one asset that could solve everything: the people he owned. 436 human beings, to be exact. Men who had families, women who had children, elderly people who had spent their entire lives laboring for the Butler family, children who had been born into chains and knew nothing else. To Pierce Butler, they were merchandise, and he was about to hold the biggest liquidation sale in American history. The auction was scheduled for March 15th and 16th, 1859. The location was Ten Broeck Racetrack in Savannah, chosen because it had the space to hold hundreds of people and the privacy to conduct business away from the city center. But calling it private was a lie. Word of the sale spread like wildfire across the South. Slave traders from Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and the Carolinas began arriving in Savannah weeks in advance, their pockets heavy with cash and their minds calculating profit margins. They came to buy labor, to buy breeders, to buy children they could raise into obedience. They came because this was an opportunity that wouldn't come again. 400 people from a single estate, all at once, all available. The advertisements in newspapers described the sale in the cold language of commerce: Negroes, rice and cotton plantation hands, long-time trained,
Family groups available. Family groups available. As if keeping families together was a selling point for livestock. In the days before the auction, the 436 people were transported from Butler Island and Hampton Point to Savannah. They traveled by boat and by wagon, shackled and terrified, with no idea what awaited them. When they arrived at the racetrack, they were herded into the horse stalls. Yes, the same stalls used for animals. Each stall was packed with people, families huddled together, children crying, elders trying to offer comfort they didn't feel. The conditions were grotesque. There was little food, less water, and no privacy. The stench of unwashed bodies and human waste filled the air. It was March, and Georgia's spring rains turned the ground into cold mud. People slept on wet straw, shivering through the nights, knowing that in the morning they would be paraded like cattle before men who saw them as investments. But even in these conditions, something remarkable happened. The people held on to each other. Mothers whispered prayers over their children. Men made quiet promises to their wives. They sang songs in the night, songs of sorrow and songs of defiance, songs that said, "We are still human, no matter what they do to us." On the morning of March 15th, the inspection began. This wasn't a simple viewing. Prospective buyers were allowed to examine the people in detail. They checked teeth like one checks a horse. They made women undress to inspect their bodies for scars, for signs of good breeding potential. They forced men to demonstrate their strength, to jump, to lift, to prove they were worth the investment. Families stood together, holding hands, praying they wouldn't be separated. Children clung to their mothers, terrified of the strange white men who touched them without permission, who spoke about them as if they weren't even there. One witness, a reporter named Mortimer Thompson, writing under the pseudonym Q.K. Philander Dostix, described the scene with barely concealed disgust. He wrote about a man named Jeffrey, who begged not to be separated from his wife, Dorcas. He wrote about a woman named Elijah who clutched her infant so tightly that a buyer had to pry the child from her arms to inspect it. He wrote about the rain that fell continuously, as if the sky itself was weeping.
The buyers arrived in waves, their carriages splashing through the mud as they pulled up to the racetrack entrance. These weren't small-time farmers looking for a single field hand. These were the wealthiest men in the South, plantation owners who controlled thousands of acres and hundreds of enslaved people already. They came with capital and calculation, treating the event like a business convention. They exchanged pleasantries, discussed crop yields and market prices, shared cigars and whiskey, while just yards away, human beings waited in horse stalls to learn their fates. Among the buyers was a man named William Butler, Pierce's own brother, who had come not out of loyalty, but out of opportunity. Even family wouldn't stand in the way of profit. The auctioneer hired for the event was Joseph Bryan, one of Savannah's most respected slave traders, a man who had built his fortune on human misery and felt no shame about it. Bryan understood the psychology of auction. He knew how to create urgency, how to play buyers against each other, how to extract maximum price from men who prided themselves on shrewd negotiation. The auction began at noon on March 15th. The format was straightforward, but devastating. Families were brought out in groups, lined up on a platform, while Bryan called out their names, ages, and skills. A man named George, 32 years old, experienced rice hand. His wife Sue, 28, cook and house servant. Their children, George Jr., 9, already working the fields. Little Martha, 6, too young for hard labor, but sold anyway. Bryan's voice was steady, businesslike, utterly devoid of humanity. He wasn't selling people, he was selling units of production. The bidding started. Hands shot up across the crowd. Numbers were shouted, $50, $75, $100. The prices climbed as men calculated not the human cost, but the economic return. How many years of labor could they extract? How many children might be born to increase their property? George and Sue stood on the platform, holding their children, watching strange men decide their future with the casual indifference of livestock traders. When the hammer fell, the family's fate was sealed. But here's where the true horror emerged.
Despite Brian's advertisements about keeping families together, that promise meant nothing. George was sold to a plantation owner from Alabama. Sue and the children went to a different buyer in Louisiana. The moment of separation was captured by Mortimer Thompson in his report. He described how George lunged forward, trying to reach his wife, how he was restrained by two men while Sue screamed his name. He described how little Martha, not understanding what was happening, kept asking why Papa was crying. The buyers showed no emotion. This was business. Families separated? That was just part of the transaction. Some buyers specifically wanted children without parents, reasoning they'd be easier to control without family ties. Others wanted young women without husbands, seeing them as breeding stock. The cruelty wasn't incidental. It was systematic. The rain continued to fall, turning the auction ground into a swamp. People waited their turn, listening to the screams of those separated before them, knowing their own moment was coming. An elderly man named Monday stood in line with his wife, Violet. They had been together for over 40 years, had raised children and grandchildren on Butler's plantations, had survived disease and back-breaking labor side by side. Monday was 67, Violet 63. At their age, they had little economic value. Buyers wanted young, strong workers. The elderly were considered burdens. When Monday and Violet's turn came, the bidding was sparse. An overseer from South Carolina offered a low price for Monday alone, needing an experienced hand to train younger workers. No one bid on Violet. She was too old, too worn down. Brian announced that she would be sold separately in a lot with other elderly women, likely to a buyer who needed domestic help. Monday's reaction was immediate and desperate. He fell to his knees, begging the buyers, begging Brian, begging God himself not to separate them. Violet collapsed beside him, her weathered hands clutching his, both of them weeping openly. The sight should have moved anyone with a shred of humanity. It didn't. The South Carolina overseer shrugged and lowered his bid, not wanting to deal with an emotional slave. Another buyer, perhaps sensing opportunity, offered to take both Monday and Violet together, but at a price so low it was insulting. Brian hesitated. Pierce Butler's instructions were clear: maximize profit. Every dollar mattered. But even Brian, a man who had sold thousands of human beings without remorse, seemed to pause at this moment. The crowd waited. The rain drummed on the roof of the covered platform. Finally, Brian accepted the lower bid. Monday and Violet would stay together. But this small mercy was an anomaly in an ocean of cruelty. For every family kept intact, a dozen were torn apart. Mothers were separated from children, husbands from wives, siblings scattered across states, knowing they would likely never see each other again. As the first day wore on, the psychological toll became visible. Some of the enslaved people stopped reacting. They stood on the platform with blank faces, eyes distant, emotionally shut down as a survival mechanism. Others couldn't stop weeping. A young woman named Anson, barely 18, was sold away from her mother and younger siblings. She screamed until her voice gave out, then collapsed on the platform, her body shaking with sobs so violent that the buyers had to wait for her to be dragged away before continuing. A man named Primus tried to run. He bolted from the line, sprinting toward the racetrack entrance, desperate for any escape. He made it perhaps 50 yards before he was tackled by guards, beaten with clubs until he couldn't stand, then dragged back to the stalls. His punishment was public, a warning to others. He was whipped in front of the waiting crowd, his back shredded, his screams echoing across the grounds. Then he was sold at a discount to a plantation known for its brutality, a place where runaways were worked to death as examples. The buyers barely noticed. They were too busy calculating, negotiating, making deals. Some formed partnerships on the spot, agreeing to split purchases and share costs. A group of Louisiana planters pooled their money to buy an entire family unit, parents, children, and cousins, planning to divide them up once they returned home. The family didn't know this yet. They stood together on the platform, relieved to be sold as a group, thinking they'd stay together. That relief would last until they reached Louisiana and were separated anyway. This was the efficiency of evil. Even moments of apparent mercy were often just delays before deeper cruelty. Joseph Bryan kept the auction moving at a brisk pace. There were over 400 people to sell in 2 days. He couldn't afford sentimentality or delays. When people broke down, they were removed. When families begged, they were ignored. When children cried for their parents, they were told to be quiet or face punishment. The machine of commerce ground forward, indifferent to human suffering. By evening of the first day, over 200 people had been sold. The remaining half waited in the stalls, listening to the sounds of separation, knowing tomorrow would bring their turn. That night was perhaps the cruelest of all. Families who had been sold to different buyers were allowed one final night together before being separated forever. Husbands held wives, memorizing the feel of their touch. Mothers pressed their faces into their children's hair, breathing in their scent one last time. People who had lived entire lives together said goodbyes that felt like dying. Some stayed up all night, refusing to waste precious hours on sleep. Others couldn't bear it and retreated into silence, staring at walls, trying to emotionally detach before the morning made it permanent. Songs rose from the stalls again, but these were different from the night before. These were songs of mourning, songs of goodbye, songs that tried to carry hope, but were weighted down by despair.
The second day of the auction began under skies that refused to clear. The rain had lessened to a persistent drizzle, but the cold remained, seeping into bones and turning the racetrack grounds into a miserable expanse of mud and standing water. The people who had survived the first day without being sold now faced their judgment. These were often the ones Brian had strategically held back: the skilled craftsmen, the house servants, the young women considered prime breeding age, and, ironically, some of the strongest family units. Brian understood auction psychology. He knew that starting with the desperate separations would establish the tone, would show buyers that sentiment had no place here. But he also knew that saving certain premium lots for day 2 would keep the wealthy buyers around, would prevent them from leaving Savannah once they'd made their initial purchases. So the second day opened with what Brian called his best offerings, though best meant most profitable, not most humanely treated. Among those brought out early on day 2 was a woman named Daphne and her 7 children. Daphne was 36 years old, a house servant who had worked in Pierce Butler's Philadelphia mansion before being sent back to the Georgia plantations when Butler's financial troubles began. She was literate, unusual for an enslaved person, having been taught to read by Pierce's ex-wife Fanny Kemble during the brief period when Fanny had tried to educate the people her husband owned. Daphne's children ranged in age from 18 down to 4. The oldest, a young man named Morris, was a trained blacksmith. The next 3 were field hands. The youngest 3 were still children, their labor value minimal, but their future potential clear to buyers looking long-term. Brian presented them as a package deal, emphasizing Daphne's skills and Morris's trade. The bidding was fierce. A Charleston plantation owner wanted Morris for his smithing abilities. A Louisiana cotton baron wanted the middle children for fieldwork. A Savannah merchant wanted Daphne as a house servant. The bids climbed higher than almost any other lot in the auction. Daphne stood on the platform with her children clustered around her, understanding exactly what was happening. She had seen the separations yesterday. She knew the promises of keeping families together were lies. As the bidding intensified, she made a decision that shocked everyone present. She spoke. In the middle of an auction, an enslaved woman addressed the buyers directly, her voice clear and firm despite her terror. She said that if they were going to separate her family, they should kill her instead, because she would not survive watching her children scattered across the South. She said Morris needed to stay with his younger siblings because their father was dead, and Morris was the only man they had. She said the youngest, a 4-year-old girl named Bess, still had nightmares and needed her mother. She said all of this knowing it could get her beaten, knowing it could make things worse, but saying it anyway because silence felt like complicity in her own destruction. The buyers' reactions were mixed. Some laughed, finding her audacity entertaining in a grotesque way. Others were offended that property would dare speak without permission. A few, a very few, looked uncomfortable, as if Daphne's words had momentarily pierced the wall of dehumanization they'd built to justify what they were doing. Joseph Brian went silent. He had conducted hundreds of auctions and had never had someone challenge the process so directly. For a moment, the entire racetrack seemed to hold its breath. Then Brian did something unexpected. He withdrew the individual bids and re-offered the family as a complete unit, all 8 people together, starting the bidding high to compensate for keeping them intact. It was a gamble. He might get less money this way, but he also might attract a buyer wealthy enough to afford the whole family, someone who saw value in an intact, skilled household unit. The strategy worked. A rice plantation owner from the South Carolina Low Country, a man named Edmund Ravenel, bid aggressively. He wanted Daphne's literacy for managing his household accounts, Morris's blacksmithing for plantation repairs, and the others for various tasks. When the hammer fell, all 8 remained together. Daphne's small victory became a story whispered among those still waiting to be sold. It gave some a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, resistance mattered. But that hope was dangerous, because for every family kept together, 10 others were destroyed. The very next lot after Daphne was a couple named Will and Clementine with their 3 children. They had watched Daphne's family stay intact and dared to believe the same might happen for them. It didn't. Will was sold to a Mississippi cotton plantation. Clementine and the children went to a buyer in Alabama. Their separation was so violent that guards had to physically restrain Will while Clementine was dragged away, their children screaming for their father. The contrast was crushing. One family's mercy followed immediately by another family's devastation. It was a reminder that in this system, kindness was arbitrary, never guaranteed, and often used to make the cruelty more palatable. The auction continued with mechanical efficiency. Brian called out names and numbers. Buyers raised hands and shouted bids. Money changed hands. People changed owners. By mid-afternoon on the second day, the emotional exhaustion was visible on everyone. The enslaved people still waiting had moved beyond terror into a kind of numb resignation.
The buyers were tired of the process, ready to conclude their business and return to their plantations. Even Brian's voice had lost some of its earlier energy, but the machine kept grinding forward, because there were still over 100 people left to sell, and Pierce Butler's debt still needed paying. Among those sold in the afternoon was a young man named York, 19 years old, who had been born on Bryan Island and had never known anything beyond the plantation. York was strong, healthy, and considered prime stock. The bidding for him was competitive, and he eventually sold for $1,750, one of the highest individual prices of the entire auction. York's buyer was a man named James Hamilton from a cotton plantation in the Georgia interior, several hundred miles from the coast. Hamilton needed strong young men for the brutal work of clearing new land, felling trees, and pulling stumps. It was work that destroyed bodies within a few years, but Hamilton didn't care about longevity. He cared about immediate productivity. York would be worked until he broke, then replaced with another young man bought at another auction. This was the mathematics of slavery. People were consumable resources, used up and discarded. York understood none of this as he was led away from the platform. He was looking back at the stalls, trying to find his mother in the crowd of faces. He never saw her. She had been sold early on day one to a Louisiana buyer and was already gone, transported out of Savannah before York even knew she was lost. He would spend the rest of his life wondering what happened to her, carrying that unanswered question like a wound that never healed. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, the final lots were called. These were the people considered least valuable, the very elderly, the sick, the injured, the children too young for work. Some sold for as little as $50. Others didn't sell at all and would be kept by Pierce Butler's brother William, who had purchased the plantations themselves, and would need some workers to keep them running. An elderly woman named Cinda, who was nearly 70 and half blind, sold for $60 to a buyer who wanted someone to watch children while their parents worked the fields. A boy named Pip, only 5 years old, was sold separately from his family for $100 to a plantation owner who believed in acquiring children young and training them from scratch. Pip screamed for his mother as he was carried away, his small voice cutting through the noise of the auction, a sound that haunted even some of the buyers, but not enough to stop what was happening. Never enough to stop it. By the time Joseph Bryan struck his final gavel on the evening of March 16, 1859, 436 human beings had been sold for a total of $303,850. The average price per person was just under $700. Children sold for less, prime-age workers for more, but averaged out, that was the value Pierce Butler's creditors had placed on human life. The money was immediately distributed to pay Pierce Butler's debts. Within weeks, he was solvent again, his reputation as a gentleman intact, his place in Philadelphia society secure. The people he sold? They were scattered across 7 states, transported in chains to plantations they'd never seen, forced to begin new lives among strangers who spoke different dialects and followed different routines. Many would never fully recover from the trauma of separation. Parents would die not knowing what happened to their children. Children would grow up with fragmented memories of families they could barely remember. The weeping time earned its name not just for the 2 days of rain and tears in Savannah, but for the generations of grief that followed. Mortimer Thompson, the journalist who witnessed the auction, published his account in the New York Tribune under the headline, "What Became of the Slaves on a Georgia Plantation?" His descriptions were vivid and damning, filled with details designed to horrify Northern readers who might have been able to ignore slavery when it was abstract and distant. He described the mud and the rain, the crying children and the broken families, the casual cruelty of men who treated human beings like furniture. His report was one of the few contemporary accounts that treated the enslaved people as individuals with names, stories, and emotions, rather than as anonymous masses. He wrote about Jeffrey and Dorcas, about Monday and Violet, about Daphne and her children. He gave them humanity on the page even though they'd been denied humanity in reality. His article was reprinted across abolitionist newspapers, becoming ammunition in the growing moral battle over slavery.
But Thompson's article, powerful as it was, couldn't undo what had happened. The people sold at the weeping time were already gone, already being worked on plantations where Northern newspapers never reached, and abolitionist sentiment was considered treason. For them, the auction was just the beginning of new suffering. Consider the journey that awaited those sold to distant states. A person bought by a Louisiana planter might spend weeks traveling, first by boat down the coast, then up rivers, then overland in chains. They traveled with strangers who had been purchased by the same buyer, people they didn't know, couldn't trust, and shared nothing with except the trauma of the auction. They slept in slave pens along the route, temporary holding facilities that were little better than prisons. They were fed minimal rations, just enough to keep them alive and functional. Women traveling in these groups faced constant threat of sexual assault from traders and overseers. Men who showed any sign of resistance were beaten as preventive measures. Children traveled in confusion and terror, not understanding where they were going or why they'd been taken from everything familiar. When they finally arrived at their new plantations, they faced the brutal work of integration into an established system. Slavery varied by region and crop. Rice plantations in the Carolina Low Country operated differently from cotton plantations in Mississippi, which operated differently from sugar plantations in Louisiana. Each had its own rhythms, its own hierarchies among the enslaved population, its own particular cruelties. Someone who had spent their entire life on Butler's rice plantations, who understood the task system and the seasonal patterns of coastal Georgia, might find themselves utterly lost on a cotton plantation in the interior, where gang labor and constant supervision were the norm. They had to learn new skills, adapt to new overseers, navigate new social dynamics among people who had been there for years and viewed newcomers with suspicion. And they had to do all of this while grieving the families they'd lost, while carrying trauma that had no outlet, no processing, no healing. Some didn't survive the transition. The combination of physical displacement, emotional devastation, and the shock of new conditions killed people. There are records of individuals purchased at the weeping time who died within months of arrival at their new plantations, their bodies simply giving out under the weight of it all. Others survived physically but broke mentally, retreating into themselves, becoming what overseers called useless because they could no longer function. A few resisted. They ran away, despite knowing the odds were impossibly stacked against them. In a new region where they knew no one, had no knowledge of the geography, and bore the visible markers of being newly purchased property, runaways from the weeping time were almost always caught. Their punishments were savage: whippings, brandings, mutilations designed to make examples of them. But they ran anyway, because the alternative was accepting that this was their life forever, and some people couldn't accept that, even when acceptance meant survival. Back in Savannah, the racetrack returned to its normal function. Within days of the auction's conclusion, horses were running again, wealthy men were placing bets, and the physical evidence of what had happened was erased. The stalls were cleaned, the mud dried, the platform was dismantled. It was as if 436 people had never been there, as if their screams and pleas had never echoed across those grounds. But the memory lingered in the black community. Enslaved people across Georgia heard about the weeping time, and it became a story told in whispers, a warning about what could happen, a reminder that no matter how long you'd been with your family, no matter how established your life seemed within the horror of slavery, it could all be taken away in an instant. The weeping time became shorthand for the absolute vulnerability of enslaved life, the reality that you were property first and human second, that economic calculations could destroy everything you loved without warning or mercy. Pierce Butler, meanwhile, returned to Philadelphia and resumed his life as if nothing had happened. He had no legal consequences for what he'd done. Selling enslaved people was not only legal but common. Large auctions happened regularly across the South, though few matched the scale of the weeping time. Butler's social standing was unaffected. He still attended parties, still belonged to exclusive clubs, still moved in circles of wealth and influence. Some of his peers may have considered the mass sale distasteful, a sign of poor financial management, but it wasn't scandalous. It was business. His ex-wife, Fanny Kemble, living in England by this point, heard about the auction and was devastated. She had known many of the people sold, had lived among them during her time on the Georgia plantations, had tried unsuccessfully to improve their conditions. The knowledge that people she'd known personally, people she'd taught to read, people who had served her meals and cared for her children, had been sold like livestock, deepened her hatred of slavery and her contempt for the man she'd married. Fanny's journal, which she'd kept private for years, suddenly seemed urgently important. In 1863, as the Civil War raged and Britain was considering recognizing the Confederacy, Fanny published her journal as a book titled Journal of a Residence on a Georgian Plantation. Her timing was strategic. Britain's elite were reading romanticized accounts of Southern plantation life, stories that painted slavery as benevolent paternalism. Fanny's book was the antidote, a first-hand account from a wealthy white woman who had lived on a slave plantation and witnessed the reality. She described the conditions on Butler Island and Hampton Point in unflinching detail: the malnutrition, the disease, the casual violence, the sexual exploitation, the separation of families. She described pregnant women forced to work until they miscarried. She described children with distended bellies from malnutrition. She described the scars on people's backs from whippings. Her account carried weight because she had no abolitionist agenda when she'd written it. She'd simply recorded what she saw, and what she saw was monstrous. The book became a sensation in Britain and helped turn public opinion against Confederate recognition. It was also read widely in the North, where it fueled abolitionist sentiment and strengthened resolve for the war. For Pierce Butler, the publication was a humiliation. His private life, his financial failures, his treatment of enslaved people, all of it was now public record, narrated by his ex-wife to audiences on both sides of the Atlantic. But by 1863, Butler had larger problems. The Civil War had begun. Union forces were moving through Georgia.
His plantations were in the path of destruction, and the people he'd once owned were about to become the agents of his final downfall. When Union troops reached the Georgia coast in 1862, they encountered the enslaved populations of the coastal plantations, including what remained of Butler's workforce. These people didn't wait for formal emancipation. They liberated themselves, leaving the plantations, guiding Union soldiers through the terrain, providing intelligence about Confederate movements. Some of Butler's former property joined the Union Army. The military had initially refused to enlist black soldiers, but by 1863, the policy changed. Thousands of formerly enslaved men enlisted, many of them motivated by the desire to strike back at the system that had brutalized them. Imagine the psychology of that moment. Men who had been sold like animals, who had been whipped for disobedience, who had watched their families destroyed, now wearing Union uniforms and carrying rifles. They fought with a ferocity born of personal stakes. This wasn't abstract politics for them. Every Confederate soldier they faced represented the system that had stolen their lives. Every plantation they helped burn was revenge for years of suffering. Former slaves from Butler's plantations participated in the March to the Sea, Sherman's devastating campaign through Georgia that destroyed the infrastructure of slavery. They watched Butler Island and Hampton Point burn, the rice fields that had been worked by generations of enslaved people, the big house where Pierce Butler had lived in comfort, the slave quarters where families had huddled in misery. All of it went up in flames. After the war, Pierce Butler tried to reclaim his plantations. The land was still legally his, though the people were not. He returned to Georgia expecting to resume operations, perhaps hiring his former slaves as paid laborers. He found ruins. The plantations were destroyed, the fields overgrown, the machinery looted or burned. The formerly enslaved people wanted nothing to do with him. Some had left the area entirely, seeking new lives in cities or in the north. Others remained nearby but refused to work for the man who had owned them. Butler attempted to negotiate labor contracts, offering wages that were insultingly low. The workers rejected them. They had tasted freedom and would not voluntarily return to anything resembling their previous conditions, even for pay. Butler's efforts to rebuild failed. He didn't have the capital to hire enough free laborers at fair wages, and he couldn't force anyone to work anymore. The economic model he'd relied on, the model that had made him wealthy, was gone. He died in 1867, bitter and diminished, his fortune destroyed, his reputation in ruins.
The formerly enslaved people from the weeping time faced a different future, one filled with possibility and peril in equal measure. Emancipation was real, the chains were legally broken, but freedom didn't erase trauma or reunite families. In the years immediately following the Civil War, thousands of formerly enslaved people across the South began desperate searches for loved ones they'd been separated from. They placed advertisements in newspapers, traveled enormous distances following rumors and hints, contacted churches and aid organizations, anything to find the mothers, fathers, children, siblings lost to auction blocks. The scale of this search was staggering. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of people were actively looking for lost family members in the late 1860s and 1870s. Some searches succeeded. There are documented cases of families reunited after decades of separation, of mothers finding children they'd last seen as infants, of siblings who had been sold to different states as children, finding each other as adults. But most searches ended in failure or ambiguity. People died in slavery without their families ever knowing. Others had been sold so many times, moved through so many owners, that the trail went cold. Names changed, either by force when new owners renamed their property, or by choice when freed people took new names as acts of self-determination. A child sold at age 5 might not even remember their original name by the time they were an adult searching for family. The geographic dispersion was vast. Someone sold from Georgia to Louisiana, then resold to Texas, then moved to Arkansas, left a trail almost impossible to follow in an era before centralized records or reliable communication systems. For the people sold at the weeping time, the search was particularly difficult because they'd been scattered in a single event across multiple states, their destinations recorded in ledgers that were private property, inaccessible to the people whose lives they documented. Consider the experience of someone like Daphne, the woman who had spoken out during the auction and managed to keep her family intact. She and her 7 children had been sold together to Edmund Ravenel's South Carolina plantation, but that didn't mean their story had a happy ending. Freedom came in 1865, when Union troops reached the area. Daphne was 42 years old. Her oldest son, Morris, was 24. Her youngest daughter, Bess, was 10. They had spent 6 years together in slavery under Ravenel, years that bonded them even tighter because they knew how rare their situation was. When freedom came, Morris wanted to leave immediately, to go north where opportunities for black people were supposedly better. Daphne wanted to stay in South Carolina, at least temporarily, to see if she could find her mother and siblings who had been sold away from Butler's plantation before the weeping time. The family split up, not by force this time, but by choice, by different visions of what freedom should look like. Morris went to Philadelphia. 3 of Daphne's middle children stayed with her. The 3 youngest scattered to different situations, some staying local, others following opportunities elsewhere. Daphne spent years searching for her mother. She placed advertisements in black newspapers like the Christian Recorder, which ran a section specifically for family searches. Her advertisement read, "Information wanted of Lucy, formerly belonging to Pierce Butler of Georgia, sold away from Butler Island in 1855. Would be about 70 years old. Last known to be in Alabama. Any information, please contact Daphne Morris in Charleston." The advertisement ran for months. She never received a response. Her mother might have been dead. She might have been alive but illiterate, unable to read the newspaper or respond to the advertisement. She might have moved from Alabama, or the information about Alabama might have been wrong from the start. Daphne never found her. She died in 1892, 47 years after emancipation, having built a life as a free woman, having seen some of her children thrive and others struggle, but always carrying the absence of her mother as an unhealed wound. Her story was typical, not exceptional. The weeping time survivors who had been separated from family faced even harder searches. A woman who had been sold away from her children in 1859 would be looking for children who are now adults, who might have different names, different locations, different lives. A man separated from his wife might be searching for a woman who had remarried, assuming he was dead or lost forever. Children sold away from parents often had the dimmest memories, just fragments of faces and voices, not even enough information to construct a useful search. The Freedmen's Bureau, established by the federal government to assist formerly enslaved people during Reconstruction, tried to help with family reunification. They maintained records, facilitated communication, and provided resources for searches. But the Bureau was understaffed, underfunded, and existed for only a few years before being shut down. The searches continued without official support, becoming a grassroots effort sustained by determination and hope against overwhelming odds. Some people gave up searching and built new families instead. This wasn't abandonment of the old family, but a recognition that survival required moving forward. A woman who couldn't find her children might take in orphaned children from her community, creating a new family structure out of shared loss. A man who couldn't find his wife might remarry, building a new life while carrying the memory of the old. These new families were just as real, just as loving as biological families, but they were formed in the shadow of absence, and that shadow never fully disappeared. The trauma of separation passed down through generations. The children born to weeping time survivors grew up hearing stories about aunts and uncles and grandparents who had been sold away, people who existed in family memory but not in family life. This created a particular kind of historical consciousness in black families, an awareness that their family trees had been deliberately destroyed, that branches had been cut off and scattered by people who saw profit in separation. Meanwhile, the white families who had profited from the weeping time faced minimal consequences. Pierce Butler died in relative comfort despite his financial ruin, never prosecuted, never held accountable beyond the loss of his wealth. Joseph Bryan, the auctioneer, continued his business through the Civil War, switching to selling Confederate bonds and supplies when the slave trade became untenable. After the war, he transitioned into other ventures and died a respected member of Savannah society. The buyers who had purchased people at the auction, who had separated families and inflicted trauma, mostly escaped any reckoning. Some lost their wealth during the war, others adapted to the new economic reality and remained prosperous. A few even claimed they had been kind masters, rewriting their own histories to erase the cruelty. Their descendants, for the most part, didn't speak about the weeping time. It wasn't included in family histories or passed down as a story worth preserving. For white Southern families, the auction was an embarrassment if it was remembered at all, something to be minimized or forgotten. This erasure was systematic. As the 19th century ended and the 20th began, the South constructed a mythology around slavery that painted it as benevolent, even beneficial for the enslaved.
This lost cause narrative portrayed enslavers as genteel aristocrats and enslaved people as content servants who were better off under white supervision than they would be in freedom. The weeping time didn't fit this mythology. It was too brutal, too obviously cruel, too clearly about profit over paternalism. So it was buried, mentioned only in passing if at all, excluded from history books and public memory. For decades, most Americans outside of black communities had never heard of it. The largest slave auction in American history became a footnote, an obscure event known mainly to historians specializing in slavery. This wasn't accidental. It was a choice, a collective decision by white society to forget what was inconvenient, to erase what was shameful. But memory persisted in black communities. The weeping time became part of the oral tradition, a story told by grandparents to grandchildren, a reminder of what had been endured and survived. In the 20th century, as the civil rights movement brought renewed attention to the history of slavery and its ongoing impacts, the weeping time began to re-emerge in public consciousness. Historians like Frederick Bancroft documented it in detail. Descendants of the people sold at the auction began researching their family histories, using whatever records survived to piece together stories. The advertisements placed by Joseph Bryan, the sales records, Mortimer Thompson's Tribune article, even Fanny Kemble's journal, all became sources for understanding what had happened and who had been affected. This research was painstaking and often frustrating because the historical record was designed to erase enslaved people's humanity. They appeared in documents as first names and prices, as labor units and property transfers, rarely as full individuals with documented histories. Despite these limitations, a picture emerged. Researchers identified many of the 436 people sold at the weeping time. They traced what happened to some of them after the auction, where they were taken, how they lived in slavery, what became of them in freedom. They found descendants, people living in the 21st century who could trace their lineage back to someone sold in Savannah in March of 1859. These descendants organized, creating connections with each other, creating a community bound by shared history. In 2009, on the 150th anniversary of the weeping time, descendants gathered in Savannah for a commemoration. They stood on the site where the racetrack had been, where their ancestors had been sold, and they honored the memory of people whose names had nearly been forgotten. It was an act of reclamation, a refusal to let that history remain buried.
The commemoration in Savannah was emotionally overwhelming for those who attended. Descendants spoke about what it meant to stand on the ground where their ancestors had been sold, to physically occupy a space that represented such profound trauma. Some had traveled from across the country, from the very states where their ancestors had been taken after the auction. A woman from Louisiana stood beside a man from Mississippi, and they discovered through conversation that their great-great-grandparents had been siblings, separated at the weeping time and never reunited. This kind of discovery happened repeatedly during the gathering. People who had been researching their family trees independently suddenly found connections, found living relatives they'd never known existed, all because of a shared link to that March day in 1859. The separations that had seemed permanent, that had defined family histories for a century and a half, were being partially healed through these meetings. Not fully healed, because the dead remained dead and the lost years couldn't be recovered, but healed enough to matter. The commemoration also sparked broader public awareness. News coverage brought the weeping time to audiences who had never heard of it. Educators began incorporating it into curricula about slavery and American history. The story became a tool for understanding not just what slavery was in abstract terms, but what it meant in concrete, human terms. Students reading about the weeping time couldn't retreat into comfortable abstractions about the peculiar institution, or states' rights, or economic systems. They had to confront the reality of children torn from parents, of elderly couples separated after 40 years together, of a woman begging for her family's unity while standing on an auction block. This specificity was crucial, because it made empathy possible in ways that statistics and generalizations never could. Knowing that 4 million people were enslaved in the United States in 1860 is important. Knowing that a specific woman named Daphne stood on a platform with her 7 children while men bid on them is devastating. Both facts are true, but one pierces the heart in ways the other cannot. The weeping time also became a lens for understanding the lasting impacts of slavery. The trauma didn't end with emancipation. It rippled forward through generations, shaping family structures, economic opportunities, and psychological inheritance. The descendants who gathered in Savannah in 2009 weren't just honoring the past. They were acknowledging how that past lived in them, how the separations and losses experienced by their ancestors had created absences and silences in their own family histories.
Many grew up with gaps in their genealogies, branches of the family tree that simply disappeared into the void of slavery's record-keeping. They had relatives they would never know about, ancestors whose names were lost, connections that had been severed by an auction and never restored. This wasn't ancient history, it was living history, present in the structure of their families and the stories they could and couldn't tell about where they came from. Economic impacts also persisted. The people sold at the weeping time generated wealth for Butler and the buyers who purchased them. That wealth accumulated, was invested, was passed down through white families as inheritance. Meanwhile, the people who actually produced that wealth, who labored in the rice fields and cotton fields, who built the infrastructure and grew the crops, received nothing. After emancipation, they started from zero. No accumulated wealth, no property, no capital to invest. The economic head start that white families gained from slavery compounded over generations, through property ownership, education, business opportunities, all the mechanisms by which wealth builds on itself. By the 21st century, the wealth gap between white and black Americans could be traced directly back to slavery and its aftermath. The weeping time was one small piece of that larger pattern, but it illustrated the mechanism perfectly. White people profited from black labor, used those profits to build generational wealth, and black people were left to build from nothing while still facing systemic barriers. The site of the weeping time itself underwent transformation over the years. The racetrack where the auction occurred was demolished in the late 19th century. The land was developed, became part of Savannah's urban expansion. For most of the 20th century, there was no marker, no indication that anything historically significant had happened there. People walked past the location daily without knowing that beneath their feet, 436 people had once stood waiting to be sold. This erasure was typical of how slavery sites were treated in the South. Unlike battlefields or presidential homes, places associated with slavery were rarely preserved or commemorated. They were allowed to disappear, to be built over, to become invisible. This invisibility was convenient for a society that wanted to move on from slavery without reckoning with it, that wanted to remember the Old South without remembering what made it function. But in recent decades, that began to change. Historical preservation efforts started including slavery sites. Markers and monuments were erected. In 2010, a historical marker was finally placed near the site of the former racetrack, explaining what had happened there in March of 1859. The marker's text was carefully worded, the result of negotiations between historians, descendant communities, and city officials. It acknowledged the horror of the auction while providing historical context. It named some of the people who were sold, giving them presence in public memory. The marker was small, easy to miss among Savannah's many historical plaques, but its existence mattered. It meant that the weeping time was now officially part of the city's historical narrative, something that couldn't be completely erased or forgotten. For descendants, the marker was validation. Their ancestors' suffering was being acknowledged, literally written in stone for anyone to see. The marker also became a site of pilgrimage. Descendants visited when they came to Savannah, standing before it, sometimes leaving flowers or small mementos. School groups came on field trips, teachers using the marker as a starting point for discussions about slavery and its legacies. Tourists stumbled across it and learned about an event they'd never heard of. The physical marker served a function that books and articles couldn't. It anchored the history to a specific place, making it tangible and real. You could stand where it happened. You could touch the marker. You could inhabit for a moment the space where this atrocity occurred. That physicality mattered because historical trauma isn't abstract. It happened in real places to real people, and marking those places helps prevent the comfortable distance that allows people to think of history as something separate from the present. The academic study of the weeping time also expanded. Historians used it as a case study for understanding the economics of slavery, the mechanisms of the domestic slave trade, and the human costs of those systems. They analyzed the auction records to understand pricing patterns, to see what characteristics made people more or less valuable to buyers, to trace the flow of capital and bodies across the South. They examined Mortimer Thompson's Tribune article for what it revealed about Northern perceptions of slavery, and how abolitionist media used specific stories to build broader arguments. They studied Fanny Kemble's journal as a source for understanding plantation life from an insider's critical perspective. Each analytical approach revealed different dimensions of the weeping time, building a more complete picture of what happened and why it mattered. The auction wasn't just a tragic event. It was a window into the entire system of American slavery, a moment when the mechanisms of dehumanization and commodification were laid bare for documentation. One particularly important area of research focused on the resistance and resilience of the people who were sold. It would be easy to tell the story of the weeping time purely as a story of victimization, of people being acted upon by forces beyond their control. That version is true, but incomplete. Even in the midst of profound powerlessness, people found ways to resist, to assert their humanity, to protect what they could. Daphne speaking out during the auction was resistance. Monday and Violet clinging to each other, refusing to be separated without making their pain visible, was resistance. The people who sang in the stalls at night, who comforted each other's children, who shared what little food they had, were resisting the dehumanization inherent in being treated as property. After the auction, resistance continued. People who ran away from their new plantations, despite the near certainty of being caught, were resisting. People who maintained family memories across decades of separation, who never stopped searching for lost loved ones, were resisting the erasure that slavery depended on. This focus on resistance was important. because it countered narratives that portrayed enslaved people as passive victims or willing participants in their own oppression. The reality was far more complex. People navigated impossible situations with whatever resources they had, making choices that balanced survival with dignity, that preserved humanity in a system designed to destroy it. The Weeping Time showed both the absolute brutality of slavery and the equally absolute refusal of enslaved people to be reduced to the property status imposed on them. They remained human, remained connected to each other, remained capable of love and hope and resistance, even when those things seemed futile. That persistence, that refusal to be broken, is as much a part of the Weeping Time's legacy as the suffering itself.
The cultural representation of the Weeping Time also evolved over the years, moving from historical documentation into artistic expression. Writers, filmmakers, and artists began using the auction as subject matter, trying to capture what words alone struggled to convey. In 2015, a historical novel titled The Weeping Time by Anne C. Bailey was published, bringing the story to a general audience through narrative rather than academic prose. Bailey, herself a historian, took the documented facts and filled in the human details, imagining the conversations, the internal thoughts, the emotional landscapes of people facing the auction. The novel followed multiple characters: a mother separated from her children, a young man sold away from his wife, an elderly couple fighting to stay together, and Pierce Butler himself, portrayed not as a simple villain, but as a man who had so thoroughly internalized the logic of slavery that he could destroy hundreds of lives and feel only relief at his debts being paid. The book's power came from its refusal to simplify, from its insistence that understanding required entering the perspectives of everyone involved, even the perpetrators. The novel sparked some controversy. Critics questioned whether it was appropriate to fictionalize such profound trauma, whether imagining the inner lives of enslaved people risked appropriating their stories or getting details wrong. Bailey defended her approach by arguing that the historical record, constrained by the racism of its time, had already erased most of the enslaved people's voices. They appeared in documents as objects, rarely as subjects. Fiction, she argued, could restore some of their subjectivity, could give them interiority and agency, even in situations where they had limited power. The debate reflected larger questions about how to represent historical trauma, how to balance accuracy with accessibility, how to tell stories that honor the dead while speaking to the living. There were no easy answers, but the conversation itself was valuable, forcing readers to think critically about whose stories get told and how. Visual artists also engaged with the Weeping Time. In 2018, an installation art piece titled 436 was exhibited in Atlanta. The piece consisted of 436 empty chairs, arranged in a grid, each with a small placard bearing a name of someone sold at the auction. The chairs were different styles, different sizes, representing the diversity of the people sold. Small chairs for children, rocking chairs for the elderly, sturdy work chairs for field hands. Visitors were invited to sit in the chairs, to occupy the space symbolically held by someone who had been sold. The experience was designed to be uncomfortable, to force physical engagement with the history rather than passive observation. Sitting in a chair labeled with a child's name, knowing that child had been sold away from their parents, created an emotional connection that reading about the auction couldn't quite achieve. The installation traveled to several cities, each time drawing crowds and media attention, each time introducing new audiences to the Weeping Time. Music became another medium for processing the history. A composer named William Dawson created a choral work titled The Weeping Time, a requiem, that premiered in 2020. The piece combined traditional African musical elements with Western classical structures, creating a soundscape that honored both the African heritage of the people sold and the American context in which they suffered. The requiem was performed by a predominantly black choir, and the lyrics were drawn from the actual words documented in historical sources: Daphne's plea to keep her family together, the song sung in the stalls, the cries of separation recorded by Mortimer Thompson. The music was haunting, beautiful, and devastating. It didn't try to redeem the suffering or find silver linings. It simply held space for grief, allowing the audience to feel the weight of what had been lost. The premiere was held in Savannah, near the site of the original auction, and many descendants attended. The performance ended in silence. No applause, just collective weeping from the audience and the performers. These artistic representations served functions that historical documentation alone couldn't. They made the Weeping Time accessible to people who would never read academic histories. They engaged emotions in ways that factual recitation didn't. They created spaces for collective mourning and remembrance. And they kept the story alive in public consciousness, preventing it from sliding back into obscurity. Each artistic work, whether novel, installation, or musical composition, was an act of resistance against erasure, a declaration that these people mattered, that their suffering wasn't just a footnote, that their names deserved to be spoken and remembered. The art also provided frameworks for descendants to process their own inherited trauma, giving language and structure to feelings that might otherwise remain inchoate and overwhelming. Educational initiatives around the weeping time expanded significantly in the 21st century. The historic site in Savannah began offering guided tours that included the auction location. These weren't typical tourist experiences. The guides, often trained historians or descendant community members, presented the history with nuance and care, encouraging visitors to think critically about slavery's mechanisms and legacies. School curricula in Georgia and other southern states began incorporating the weeping time as a case study. Teachers used primary sources like Thompson's article and the auction advertisements to help students understand historical research methods while learning about the content. Some schools partnered with descendant communities, inviting speakers to share family histories and personalize the historical narrative. These educational efforts were crucial for ensuring that new generations understood this part of American history, understood it not as abstract evil, but as specific choices made by specific people with specific consequences. However, education around the weeping time also faced resistance. In some communities, parents and school board members objected to teaching what they called divisive or negative history. They argued that focusing on slavery's brutality would make white students feel guilty or uncomfortable, or that it presented America in an unfairly negative light. These objections reflected larger debates about how American history should be taught, debates that intensified in the 2010s and 2020s around concepts like critical race theory. Educators and historians responded by emphasizing that teaching about the weeping time wasn't about assigning guilt, but about understanding historical facts and their ongoing impacts. Discomfort, they argued, was appropriate when learning about atrocities. Comfort wasn't the goal of historical education. Truth was. And the truth was that the weeping time happened, that it devastated hundreds of lives, and that its effects rippled forward into the present. The descendants themselves became powerful advocates for remembrance and education. Many formed organizations dedicated to preserving the memory of the weeping time and supporting research into family histories. One such organization, the Weeping Time Descendant Coalition, established a scholarship fund for students researching slavery and its legacies. They funded archaeological work at the former plantation sites, hoping to uncover physical evidence of how enslaved people had lived. They lobbied for more comprehensive historical markers and for the preservation of any remaining structures connected to the auction. They also worked to connect descendants with each other, maintaining databases of family trees and hosting regular gatherings. This work was largely volunteer, driven by people who had jobs and families and other responsibilities, but who felt compelled to honor their ancestors by ensuring their stories survived. The coalition also engaged in public advocacy around contemporary issues connected to slavery's legacy. They supported reparations initiatives, arguing that the unpaid labor of their ancestors had generated wealth that still existed in white families and institutions. They advocated for criminal justice reform, drawing connections between slavery, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration. They pushed for educational equity, pointing out that the descendants of enslaved people still face systemic barriers to quality schooling and economic opportunity. For them, remembering the weeping time wasn't just about the past. It was about understanding how the past shaped the present, and using that understanding to demand justice. The auction had been about power, about some people claiming the right to own and sell others. The descendants' activism was about reclaiming power, about asserting that they were not defined by what had been done to their ancestors, but were empowered by their ancestors' survival and resistance. International attention also came to the weeping time, particularly from communities in Africa and the Caribbean interested in the African diaspora. The auction became a point of connection between African Americans and people whose ancestors had remained in Africa or had been taken to different parts of the Americas. Conferences on the transatlantic slave trade began including sessions on the domestic slave trade, recognizing that the auction blocks of Savannah and New Orleans were part of the same system as the slave forts on Africa's coast. This global perspective helped situate the weeping time within the larger history of slavery, colonialism, and racial capitalism. It also created opportunities for solidarity across diaspora communities, for recognizing shared histories of trauma, and shared projects of remembrance and resistance. The archaeological work at Butler Island and Hampton Point revealed layers of history that documents alone couldn't capture. Beginning in 2012, teams of archaeologists began systematic excavations of the former plantation sites. What they found was both expected and surprising. The foundations of slave quarters were located and excavated, revealing the material conditions of daily life. Archaeologists found fragments of pottery, some clearly mass-produced items provided by the plantation, others handmade in African styles, evidence that enslaved people maintained cultural practices and created beauty even in bondage. They found children's toys carved from wood and bone, small dolls and spinning tops, proof that childhood existed even in slavery, that parents tried to give their children moments of play amid the labor. They found hidden spaces beneath floorboards where people had concealed personal items, tiny acts of ownership and privacy in a system that denied both. The excavations also uncovered evidence of resistance. Archaeologists found tools that had been deliberately broken, subtle sabotage that would slow work without being obvious enough to provoke punishment. They found the remains of small gardens near the quarters, places where enslaved people had grown their own food to supplement meager rations, exercising control over at least one aspect of their lives. Most poignantly, they found graves. The plantation owners had kept minimal records of enslaved people who died, often not even recording names, just noting a loss of property. But the graves told a different story. They were carefully arranged, oriented according to African burial traditions, marked with items that had personal significance. These burials showed that even when the system treated people as disposable, communities of enslaved people honored their dead, maintained funeral practices, created sacred spaces that asserted the humanity of the deceased. Some graves were of children, tiny plots that spoke to the devastating mortality rates on rice plantations. Malaria, dysentery, accidents, malnutrition, all claimed young lives regularly. Finding these graves affected the archaeologists profoundly, many of whom had to pause their work to process the emotional weight. One archaeologist described uncovering a grave containing an infant and a small wooden cross, clearly handmade, inscribed with the word angel. The plantation records showed no death recorded around that time period. This child had lived and died without Butler or his overseers even noting the loss. But the child's family had noted it, had mourned, had marked the grave with love and care. That small wooden cross, preserved in Georgia's humid soil for over 150 years, became one of the most powerful artifacts recovered from the site. It was put on display at a museum in Savannah, and visitors often left flowers beside it, offering belated recognition to a child whose name was never recorded, but whose existence mattered. The archaeological findings complicated the historical narrative in important ways. Documents from the period, written by enslavers and their allies, often portrayed slavery as a system where enslaved people were well cared for and relatively content. The physical evidence told a different story. The poor quality of the housing materials, the limited personal possessions, the evidence of malnutrition and skeletal remains, all contradicted the mythology of benevolent paternalism. But the evidence also showed that enslaved people were not passive victims waiting for rescue. They created culture, maintained families, practiced religion, built communities, all while enduring conditions designed to break them. The archaeology revealed both the horror of slavery and the strength of the people who survived it. This dual truth was essential for understanding the full scope of the weeping time and slavery more broadly. The descendants of those sold at the weeping time had mixed reactions to the archaeological work. Some found it healing to have physical evidence of their ancestors' lives, to see objects their ancestors might have touched, to visit places their ancestors had lived. It made the history tangible in ways that documents couldn't. Others found it painful, feeling that excavating slave quarters was disturbing their ancestors' spaces, potentially disrespectful, even when done with the best intentions. These concerns led to important conversations about who controlled historical narratives and archaeological sites. The archaeologists adjusted their methods, consulting closely with descendant communities, involving them in decisions about what to excavate and how to display findings. Some descendants participated directly in the excavations, working alongside professional archaeologists, literally unearthing their own family histories. One particularly significant discovery came in 2016, when archaeologists found what appeared to be a school area in one of the slave quarters. This was unexpected because teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in Georgia and most other southern states. Yet the evidence was clear. Slates for writing, fragments of a primer book, even a small stash of paper hidden in a wall cavity. The most likely explanation was that someone, possibly Daphne, who had been taught to read by Fanny Kemble, had been secretly teaching others despite the enormous risk. If caught, the punishment would have been brutal, possibly fatal. But someone had decided that literacy was worth the risk, that knowledge was a form of freedom even if physical freedom wasn't possible. This discovery became a powerful symbol for descendants, proof that their ancestors had valued education, had resisted the laws designed to keep them ignorant, had prepared for a future they might never see, but hoped their children might. The findings from Butler Island and Hampton Point were published in academic journals and presented at conferences, contributing to the broader scholarly understanding of slavery. But they were also shared with the public through museum exhibitions, documentaries, and community presentations. The Savannah History Museum created a permanent exhibit on the weeping time,
that incorporated archaeological findings, historical documents, artistic representations, and oral histories from descendants. The exhibit didn't sanitize the history. It showed the auction advertisements with their dehumanizing language. It displayed the chains and shackles used to restrain people during transport. It presented Mortimer Thompson's eyewitness account in full, not edited to reduce discomfort. But it also centered the humanity of the people sold, displaying their photographs when available, sharing their names, telling their stories beyond the moment of the auction. The exhibit included an interactive component where visitors could explore a database of the 436 people sold, seeing what was known about their lives before and after the auction. For some individuals, the information was extensive: names, ages, family relationships, skills, where they were sold, sometimes even what happened to them after emancipation. For others, the database contained heartbreakingly little, just a first name and a price. These gaps in the record were themselves educational, showing visitors how the documentation of slavery was designed to erase enslaved people's full humanity. The database also included a feature where descendants could contribute information, building a crowdsourced history that grew more complete over time. Descendants added family stories, photographs, genealogical research, creating a living memorial that continued to evolve. The museum exhibit became one of Savannah's most visited historical attractions, drawing tourists and school groups from across the country. Visitor responses were recorded in a comment book, and the entries revealed how differently people processed the history. Some visitors, particularly white visitors, expressed shock and shame, writing that they hadn't known about the weeping time despite growing up in Georgia. Others, particularly black visitors and descendants, wrote about recognition and validation, grateful to see their ancestors' experiences acknowledged and honored. A few visitors left hostile comments, complaining about focusing on negative history or claiming the exhibit was exaggerated. These comments themselves became part of the historical record, showing how contested slavery's memory remained, how some people actively resisted reckoning with the past. The controversy around memory and representation intensified in the late 2010s and early 2020s, as broader national debates about Confederate monuments and the teaching of American history heated up. In Savannah and other southern cities, there were calls to remove statues honoring Confederate generals and political leaders, many of whom had been enslavers. Opponents of removal argued that these monuments were part of heritage and history, that removing them erased the past. Proponents countered that the monuments were erected not to preserve history, but to intimidate black citizens and glorify a rebellion fought to preserve slavery. The weeping time became part of these debates. Advocates for monument removal pointed out that Savannah had multiple statues honoring Confederate figures, but only one small marker acknowledging the largest slave auction in American history. They argued that this imbalance revealed whose history the city valued, whose suffering was considered worthy of prominent memorialization.
The monument debates ultimately led to action. In 2020, following the national protests sparked by George Floyd's murder and the broader reckoning with racism, Savannah's City Council voted to relocate several Confederate monuments from prominent public spaces to museums where they could be contextualized historically rather than honored uncritically. The decision was contentious, producing heated city council meetings where residents argued passionately on both sides. Descendants of the weeping time were vocal in supporting the removals, arguing that public space should honor victims of slavery rather than its perpetrators. Some white residents, particularly those with Confederate ancestry, opposed the removals, seeing them as attacks on their heritage. The debates revealed how present the past remained, how unresolved the questions about slavery and its legacy still were more than 150 years after emancipation. As part of the same initiative, the City Council approved funding for a major memorial to the weeping time. The memorial would be located near the site of the former racetrack, would be substantial rather than just a small marker, and would be designed in consultation with descendant communities and historians. The design process took 2 years and involved public input sessions, design competitions, and extensive debate about what form the memorial should take. Some proposals were figurative, featuring sculptures of families being separated. Others were abstract, using space and material to evoke loss and memory without literal representation. The final design, selected in 2022, was a combination of both approaches. It featured a central plaza with 436 individual stones, each engraved with a name of someone sold at the auction. Surrounding the plaza were bronze figures depicting moments from the auction: a mother holding a child, an elderly couple embracing, a man in chains looking toward the horizon. The memorial also included a reflection pool with an inscription from Mortimer Thompson's account. The wind blew cold, and the rain fell in torrents, adding to the dismal aspect of the scene, while the weeping and wailing of those who were being torn from each other could be heard far above the noise of the storm. Visitors could walk among the stones, reading names, pausing at the sculptures, sitting beside the reflection pool. The design was intentionally contemplative rather than didactic, creating space for individual emotional responses rather than prescribing how people should feel. Educational plaques provided historical context, but the memorial itself was primarily about presence and remembrance. It said, "These people existed, they mattered, and we will not forget them." The memorial was scheduled to be completed and dedicated in 2025. While the memorial was being planned and constructed, the descendants continued their work of research and connection. DNA testing became a new tool in their efforts to understand family relationships and trace lineages. Several descendants participated in genetic genealogy projects, hoping to identify relatives and fill gaps in family trees that documentary records couldn't bridge. The results were sometimes surprising. People who had believed themselves to be distant cousins discovered they were more closely related. Others found connections to families they'd never known about, descendants of siblings or cousins who had been separated at the weeping time and lost track of each other. DNA testing also connected some descendants to specific regions of Africa, providing links to ancestral homelands that slavery had severed. These connections were meaningful for people whose family histories had been deliberately destroyed by the slave trade. However, DNA testing also raised ethical questions. Some descendants were uncomfortable with the commercialization of genetic data, particularly given the historical exploitation of black bodies for medical research without consent. There were concerns about privacy, about what companies might do with genetic information, about whether participation in these databases could have unforeseen consequences. These concerns were particularly acute in black communities with living memories of abuses like the Tuskegee syphilis study. The descendants navigated these issues thoughtfully, making individual choices about participation while discussing the broader implications collectively. Some chose to test, seeing it as a tool for reclaiming what slavery had taken. Others declined, preferring to maintain privacy and refusing to participate in systems they didn't fully trust. The academic study of the weeping time also took new directions in the 21st century. Historians began using digital humanities tools to analyze the auction data in sophisticated ways. They created network maps showing how the 436 people were related to each other before the auction, visualizing the family and community structures that existed on Butler's plantations. These visualizations made starkly clear what the auction destroyed: dense webs of kinship and connection, communities that had been built over generations, all torn apart in 2 days. The digital maps were powerful because they showed not just individual separations, but the systemic destruction of social fabric. Slavery didn't just separate parents from children, it annihilated entire community structures, leaving survivors to rebuild from fragments. Researchers also traced the economic flows from the auction, following the money Pierce Butler received and seeing how it was distributed among his creditors. They found that some of the creditors were Northern merchants and bankers, complicating narratives that placed slavery's guilt solely on the South. The North had been economically entangled with slavery, had profited from it even while claiming moral opposition. Northern textile mills depended on Southern cotton. Northern banks financed plantation expansions. Northern merchants traded in slave-produced goods. The weeping time auction money ultimately flowed to institutions in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. This research challenged comfortable regional divisions, showing that slavery was an American institution, not just a Southern one, and that reckoning with its legacy required confronting Northern complicity as well as Southern perpetration. Some of the institutions that had received money from the auction still existed in the 21st century, now as banks, insurance companies, or investment firms. Researchers documented these connections and published them, sparking calls for institutional accountability. A few institutions responded by acknowledging their historical connections to slavery and funding educational initiatives or scholarship programs for descendants. Others denied responsibility, arguing that modern corporations shouldn't be held accountable for the actions of predecessor institutions from a century and a half ago. These debates mirrored larger questions about reparations.
whether and how contemporary institutions and governments should address historical injustices, who should receive compensation, and what form that compensation should take. The weeping time became a case study in reparations discussions. The harm was documented, the victims identifiable, the perpetrators and beneficiaries known. Some descendants argued that this specificity made the weeping time an ideal test case for targeted reparations. If institutions that had profited from the auction could be identified, if descendants could be documented through genealogical research, then a direct form of reparations became conceivable. Advocates proposed that institutions with proven connections to the auction establish trust funds for descendants, funding education, healthcare, housing, or business development. Critics of reparations argued that the connections were too distant, that current generations bore no responsibility for ancestors' actions, that practical implementation would be impossible. The debates were contentious and unresolved, but the weeping time provided a concrete framework for discussing abstract principles. Beyond policy debates, the weeping time continued to resonate in popular culture. In 2023, a documentary film titled The Weeping Time: Voices from the Auction premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. The film combined historical reenactments with interviews with descendants, historians, and archaeologists. It used CGI to reconstruct the racetrack as it would have appeared in 1859, showing viewers the physical space where the auction occurred. Actors portrayed some of the documented individuals: Daphne pleading for her family, Monday and Violet clinging to each other, York being sold away from his mother. The reenactments were interspersed with descendants reading from historical documents, their voices in life to the words of their ancestors. The film was emotionally devastating, but also formally innovative, using cinematic techniques to create empathy and understanding. The documentary received critical acclaim and was picked up by a major streaming platform, giving it wide distribution. Millions of viewers who had never heard of The Weeping Time watched the film, many sharing their reactions on social media. The film sparked conversations about slavery's legacy, about contemporary racism, about how historical trauma persists. It also generated some backlash from people who felt the film was too harsh on white historical figures, or too focused on pain rather than resilience. These criticisms reflect ongoing tensions about how slavery should be represented, whether focusing on suffering risked reducing enslaved people to victimhood, or whether avoiding the brutal reality dishonored what they endured. The filmmakers defended their choices, arguing that both suffering and resilience needed to be shown, that the full truth included both horror and humanity.
The impact of the documentary extended beyond individual viewers. Educators incorporated it into curricula, using it as a teaching tool that brought the weeping time to life for students who learned better through visual media than through reading. The film's streaming platform created a companion educational website with lesson plans, primary source documents, and discussion guides for teachers. Schools across the country, not just in the South, began teaching the weeping time as a case study in slavery, using the specificity of the event to make larger historical patterns comprehensible. Students researched individual people sold at the auction, creating presentations about their lives. They analyzed the economic documents to understand how slavery functioned as a business system. They read Mortimer Thompson's eyewitness account and discussed the role of journalism in shaping public opinion. These educational efforts ensured that new generations would know the story, would understand that slavery wasn't abstract history, but a system of specific cruelties inflicted on specific people. The streaming platform also commissioned a podcast series that went deeper than the documentary could in its 90-minute runtime. The podcast, titled 436, devoted each episode to a different individual or family sold at the auction. Researchers had compiled extensive information on about 50 of the people sold, enough to tell detailed stories. For each of these 50, the podcast created a narrative episode, tracing their life before the auction, their experience of being sold, and whatever was known about their life afterward. Some episodes ended with reunions in freedom, with successful searches for lost family members, with stories of survival and achievement despite everything. Others ended with uncertainty, with trails that went cold, with questions that would never be answered. The podcast made space for both triumph and tragedy, refusing to impose artificial resolution on stories that remained incomplete. Listeners responded intensely to the podcast. Many wrote to the producers sharing their own family histories of slavery and separation,
creating an archive of stories that hadn't been previously documented. Some listeners were descendants of the Weeping Time, who learned new information about their ancestors from the podcast's research. Others were people with no connection to the Weeping Time, but who felt compelled to engage with this history more deeply than they had before. The podcast created a community of listeners who discussed episodes on forums, who shared genealogical research tips, who supported each other through the emotional difficulty of confronting this history. This community demonstrated how media could create space for collective processing of historical trauma, how stories could build connections across differences of race, region, and relationship to the history. The 50th episode of the podcast was special, focusing not on an individual sold at the auction, but on the question of memory itself. The episode asked, why does the Weeping Time matter now, more than 160 years ago? Why should contemporary Americans care about an auction that happened before anyone currently alive was born? The episode featured interviews with descendants, historians, activists, and educators, each offering their perspective. Descendants spoke about inherited trauma, about how the separations of 1859 created absences in their families that still existed. Historians spoke about how slavery shaped American economic development, about how the wealth generated by forced labor created inequalities that persisted into the present. Activists spoke about connections between historical and contemporary injustices, about how understanding the Weeping Time illuminated ongoing struggles against systemic racism. Educators spoke about the importance of truth-telling in creating a just society, about how acknowledging the past was necessary for moving forward. The episode concluded with a powerful statement from one of the descendants, a woman whose great-great-great-grandmother had been sold at the Weeping Time and separated from her children. She said, "People ask why we can't just move on, why we keep bringing up slavery like it happened yesterday. But when my grandmother died, she died not knowing what happened to her grandmother's siblings. That's not ancient history. That's my family. The Weeping Time didn't just hurt the people who were there. It hurt everyone who came after them, everyone who grew up with pieces missing from their family tree, everyone who had to build an identity out of fragments because slavery destroyed the whole. So we remember because forgetting would be another kind of violence. We remember because our ancestors deserve to be known. And we remember because the same systems that allowed the Weeping Time to happen are still operating, just in different forms, and we can't dismantle what we won't acknowledge." Her words captured what the Weeping Time had come to represent, not just a historical event, but a lens for understanding American history, a test of whether the nation could face its past honestly, and a call to address ongoing injustices rooted in that past. The auction was over, but its consequences continued. The people sold were long dead, but their descendants lived with the aftermath. The money exchanged had been spent generations ago, but the wealth disparities it created remained. The Weeping Time was simultaneously history and present, a moment in time and an ongoing reality. This dual nature made it a powerful tool for education and activism, a concrete example that could make abstract concepts like systemic racism and generational trauma understandable. By 2025, the Weeping Time had achieved a level of public recognition unimaginable even a generation earlier. It appeared in history textbooks. Museums across the country included it in exhibits on slavery. The memorial in Savannah was nearing completion. Descendants had formed a robust network spanning multiple states. Academic research continued to uncover new information. Artists continued to create works inspired by the history. And yet, despite this progress, the work of remembrance and reckoning remained incomplete. There were still people who had never heard of the Weeping Time. There were still institutions that resisted acknowledging their connections to slavery. There were still debates about how honestly to teach this history, about whether focusing on it was divisive or necessary. The struggle over memory itself remained contested terrain. The descendants understood that their work would never truly be finished. Each generation would need to relearn the history, would need to decide how to carry it forward, would need to find new ways to make it relevant to contemporary concerns. The memorial in Savannah would require maintenance and protection. The archives of research and oral histories would need to be preserved and made accessible. The connections between descendants would need to be maintained through regular gatherings and communications. This was not a burden they resented, but a responsibility they embraced. They saw themselves as stewards of their ancestors' memory, as keepers of a story that America needed to hear even when it didn't want to listen. Their work was an act of love, of honoring people who had suffered unimaginably, but had survived, had resisted, had maintained their humanity against a system designed to destroy it. The Weeping Time also served as a reminder of what was lost to historical erasure. 436 people were sold in March of 1859,
but researchers had only managed to identify and trace about 150 of them with any detail. The rest remained names without stories, or sometimes just blank spaces in the auction record where even names hadn't been preserved. Those absences were as much a part of the history as the documented stories. They represented all the people whose lives were lived and lost without record, whose suffering went unacknowledged, whose resistance went unnoticed, whose humanity was denied even by history itself. The descendants mourned these absences, acknowledged that their own family trees had similar gaps, recognized that slavery had been designed to erase as thoroughly as it exploited. Yet even incomplete memory was valuable, even fragmentary stories mattered. Even knowing that someone existed, that they were sold at the weeping time, that they endured and survived or didn't survive, even that minimal knowledge was worth preserving, because it said, you existed, you mattered, you are not forgotten. The descendants worked to honor both the known and the unknown, to create space for mourning all the people who had been sold, not just the ones whose stories could be fully told. The memorial's 436 stones included some with just initials or question marks, acknowledging people whose names hadn't been preserved, but whose presence in the historical record proved they were real. This honoring of absence, this memorialization of what was lost and couldn't be recovered, was perhaps the most powerful aspect of the descendants' work. As the memorial's dedication day approached in late 2025, descendants from across the country made plans to attend. Some had attended previous gatherings and would be reuniting with family members they'd met through the Descendants Network. Others would be attending for the first time, making the pilgrimage to Savannah to stand where their ancestors had stood, to honor the memory of people they'd never known but whose blood they carried. The dedication was planned as both a solemn ceremony and a celebration, acknowledging the pain of the past while celebrating the survival and resilience that led to the present. There would be speeches from descendants, historians, and elected officials. There would be music, including performances of spirituals that would have been sung by the people sold at the auction. There would be a reading of names, all 436, spoken aloud so that each person would be individually acknowledged. And there would be silence, moments of collective quiet to honor grief that words couldn't adequately express. The weeping time had become more than just history. It had become a touchstone for conversations about justice, memory, and accountability. It had become a community, a network of descendants and allies working to ensure the story survived. It had become art, inspiration for novels and films and music and memorials. It had become education, a case study that helped millions of people understand slavery's reality and legacy. It had become activism, a call to address ongoing injustices rooted in slavery's aftermath. Most fundamentally, it had become a testament to the people who survived it, to their strength and their suffering, to their resistance and their resilience. The weeping time was their story, and telling it, remembering it, honoring it, was the work of ensuring that their lives mattered, that their pain wasn't in vain, that their descendants could stand in the present and say, we remember you, we honor you, and we will not let you be forgotten.